All the way back in 4.6, I posted a video on Asha, my custom character centered around the burning reaction. I was fortunate enough to make that before 4.7 came out, since beta leaks for Emily in 4.8 would start arising at that time. Unfortunately, Auroron came out in 5.2, and his kit centered around the electrocharge reaction. So this time around, I can't say that I predicted any kits, since I'm technically late to the party. But I'm stubborn, and I am not letting this guy ruin my plans. What were my plans exactly? I'm so glad you asked. Rather than making one electrocharge character, I chose to make two. The first is what I'll cover in this video. His name is Arashi, and he's going to be an electrocharge DPS. In a similar vein to Auroron, he's going to deal increased damage when the reaction is present. Meanwhile, the second character is going to be Kaito, an electrocharged buffer. His kit will focus on buffing the reaction itself, similarly to Nilou. He'll have his time in the spotlight in part 2 of this special. Then, I'll have a third part where I go into more depth on their intended kit designs and synergies as a duo, and also have a fun lore section to cover their backstory. Before we begin, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, and music credits are down below. Captions are available for anyone who needs them, and without further ado, let's get started. So, let's start off with Arashi and explain his kit design. He's going to be an Electro user. I chose this over Hydro, because I wanted to try the challenge of making this guy a better DPS in Electrocharge teams without making him godly in Quicken. For his weapon, I'll be giving him a Claymore. This will be somewhat relevant later on when we talk about game design and elemental application. And for his Ascension stat, he gets a 19.2% crit rate bonus. With how his kit is designed, this is slightly more valuable over crit damage. Little side note, from now on, I'm going to refer to Electrocharged as EC. Let's get into the specifics of his kit abilities now. For Arashi's basic attacks, I'm just going to say he has a similar pattern to Beidou. Regular swings with normals, a barrage of hits with his charged, and a plunging attack, which is a plunging attack. His basic attacks are somewhat relevant, but it's not going to be his main source of damage, so I don't feel bothered to cover it as much. For his skill, Arashi will infuse his Claymore with Electro and will also briefly apply Electro onto himself. This damage gains a very tiny bonus scaling with his max HP, on top of the existing attack multipliers. The infusion is mainly there for Electro application, not damage. When his normal and charge attacks hit opponents, Arashi will gain 2 stacks of voltage. This particular method can get a stack once every 0.3 seconds. When enemies take EC damage, Arashi will absorb some of that power and gain 5 stacks of voltage. Gaining stacks in this way can occur once every 0.5 seconds. In addition to getting the 5 stacks, Arashi will take electro damage equal to 2% of his max HP. This self-damage will not be increased through damage bonus or crit stats, but it can be decreased through electro resistance or damage reduction. The self-damage can't be absorbed by shields, but shields will still be fine to use for the sake of blocking external damage and providing interruption resistance. For the most part, this self-damaging mechanic is just meant to give Arashi a couple artifact options based on HP manipulation. On a visual or lore level, it's kind of like he's siphoning some of that electricity to power himself up, but doing so harms him slightly in the process. Let's move on to what voltage stacks do. Arashi can hold a maximum of 20 stacks, and once Arashi reaches 20 stacks, he can recast his skill and deal a massive AoE strike of electro damage. This damage will scale on his max HP, and it will be considered as skill damage. It should also be noted that the multiplier on this attack is a huge scaling. For the best comparison, the way his skill is designed is heavily influenced by Kenichi. He has a skill which does special normal attacks to charge up his meter, additional things can also charge it up further to allow for more shot frequency, and then he deals a massive hit of skill damage which has an insanely high multiplier. Arashi's kit works in the same way, but without the Night Soul stuff. For some of the final standard notes, his infused duration is going to be 10 seconds, his cooldown is 16 seconds, and the first hit of his massive skill instance generates 4 electro particles. For Arashi's burst, he will simply deal a massive hit of electro damage based on his max HP. He will also heal himself based on his max HP. This healing occurs in 3 instances rather than a single burst of healing. It will have a 60 cost burst with a 15-second cooldown. Additionally, it will apply Electro with its singular hit. All in all, pretty easy to wrap your head around, it's basically the same thing as Mualani's burst. For his A1 passive, after using his burst, he will grant the entire party a 20% ER bonus for 10 seconds. This is a small little buff to help the party with their energy needs, especially since a lot of his intended teammates might come with some pretty high energy thresholds. For his A4 passive, Arashi's skill and burst damage is increased by 1.2% for every 1000 max HP he has, up to a max of 36%. This translates to a 30,000 max HP threshold, and it's just there to further increase all of his damage. In a similar vein, it's kind of like Furina's A4 passive where she gets a bonus based on her max HP. Now that I've covered his base kit, I'll quickly cover some of my design philosophy and why I made the choices I made. My main goal was to make an EC DPS that won't benefit too much from Dendro reactions in the process. I didn't want to add the rule that the team had to be purely Electro or Hydro, since that's a bit of a cop-out mechanic. So instead, I followed some mechanics similar to Kinich. Yes, we're going back to him, because the actual mechanics involved with elemental application and reactions are similar between the two characters. The first trait is that Arashi has very slow application on his main hits of damage. If you use his skill, you can maybe get a hit every 3 seconds. On the idea of Quicken, characters use this reaction in tandem with very frequent hits, allowing them to trigger the reaction much faster. When you have more instances of Quicken, it also incentivizes EM builds to further capitalize on the reaction. Arashi's main damage source doesn't have very fast application, and he also doesn't have additional EM scaling in his kit. When it comes to his auto attacks, they are faster sources of application, but the damage itself is pretty low, so even with Quicken, it's not that much of a bonus. In fact, making him a Claymore user further slows down his application, since that weapon has a much slower attack speed compared to the rest. You can technically still use him as a Hyper Bloom trigger, but that build ignores most of his kit design, and his personal damage is intended to be much higher than the EM-focused builds. There was also the idea to make his base scalings extremely high. By setting a high floor for his damage, it creates diminishing returns on Quicken's buffing. Even if you do run him in some kind of Quicken or Hyper Bloom team, the difference in his damage is going to be somewhat minimal, so it won't buff him by a huge margin. This also further pushes him away from EM builds and only encourages finding a couple roles in substats. I'll also take some time to explore more of the similarities and differences between him and Oraron. I had this idea before he was officially revealed, so I was kind of surprised that they had a lot of similarities. Oraron is what I coin as a reaction capitalizer, which means he doesn't buff the reaction itself, he buffs his own kit based on the reaction being present. Similarly, Arashi does the exact same thing. Both have passives that buff energy one way or another. Both are mainly damage dealers, but Oraron's is off-field friendly while Arashi is an on-fielder. Oraron is attack scaling and also has attack buffing, while Arashi is HP scaling. So that means there's slight anti-synergy in Oraron's support potential. As you can see though, the kits were different enough to where I felt comfortable sharing the idea, without also feeling like I was presenting a carbon copy. There are still other aspects I have yet to talk about, such as why Arashi scales on max HP in the first place, or why he has a support passive in his A1. This will be expanded upon in upcoming videos. Now that we've covered his main kit, let's see what his constellations provide. For C1, every time Arashi takes damage, he will gain a 3% crit damage bonus. This can stack up to 10 times and will last for 10 seconds. Overall, just a nice boost in damage. At C2, Arashi can now stack up to 30 stacks instead of 20. His basic attacks will now generate 3 stacks instead of 2, and the voltage stacks gained from EC will now stack up to 7 instead of 5. If he casts his special skill while above 20 stacks, the base multiplier increases based on 3% of his max HP for every stack above 20, up to a max of 30% bonus HP scaling. This constellation further increases his skill's ability to deal damage. You can also have a choice in playstyle with this. Do you use your skill immediately and more frequently with lower damage each hit? Or do you wait a bit to max out the stacks, which are less frequent hits but also higher damage per hit? At C3, his burst level is increased by 3. All it really does is increase his burst damage and his self-healing. At C4, whenever a party member other than Arashi casts their burst, Arashi gains a stack of Lonesome Storm. Each stack will cause Arashi's burst to deal an additional instance of damage equal to 70% of the original multiplier. This can stack up to 3 times, and stacks are consumed when Arashi casts his burst. You know how Yae Miko's burst does that thing where it deals up to 4 hits when she consumes her turrets? Same concept. With max stacks, his burst does 4 consecutive hits of damage. However, since his burst follows standard ICD, only the first and last hits will apply Electro. At C5, his skill level is increased by 3. This increases the base damage of his skill, as well as a small HP scaling bonus to his auto attacks. At the end of the day, it's just more damage. Finally, C6 unlocks its full potential. When normal charged and plunging attacks hit enemies, his skill will automatically activate, dealing damage identical to its original multipliers. This can only occur 5 times per skill cast. I don't have much to say, it's really just more front-loaded damage. Anyway, let's move on to his best builds, starting with artifacts. For your main stat options, he's going to be running the standard damage build. That means he wants an HP Sand, an Electro Damage Goblet, and either of the crit circlets. Depending on your build, Arashi might be getting a lot of damage percent bonuses already, so an HP Goblet might also be a better choice in some of those cases. For your best sets, he has 2 main options to choose from. I would say it's dependent on whether you give him a crit rate weapon or a crit damage weapon. I'll start off with the crit damage weapon first. Doing this means you have more room for crit rate, and if his kit has an HP manipulation mechanic, then that means Marushasei is his best option. Since his normal and charge attacks aren't major contributions to his damage, the 2-piece effect is less effective, but 36% crit rate is a valuable asset for all-around damage output. If you run him on a crit rate weapon, then there's a high chance running Marushasei is going to immediately cap out the stat. So in that case, his best option would be Vorokasha's Glow. He has HP scaling, which works with the 2-piece effect, he benefits a lot from the 50% skill and burst damage bonus, and his self-damaging mechanic is actual damage, not just an HP loss. This means, unlike other HP manipulators, he can reliably proc the effect. For other options, Thundering Fury technically works because of the electro damage and electro reaction bonuses, but since EC enemies are affected by Electro and Hydro, I think Thunder Soother's 35% damage bonus works a bit better for his personal damage. Additionally, since the damage he inflicts on himself is Electro, the 2-piece Electro Res bonus will reduce his damage taken. For the next section, let's talk about Arashi's weapon options. General crit weapons should be his best in slot, since it increases his personal damage the best. But even still, HP weapons work as a backup option. First on the list... yes, the Bell is unironically fine on him. Taking damage from the voltage stacks is still going to work even if he's shielded, so that part of his kit remains unaffected. And because it's unaffected, giving him a shield to prevent taking extra damage or providing interruption resistance is a good way to provide some comfort. And if he has a shield, he deals extra damage, which is always nice to have. On to better options, Portable Power Saw has an HP bonus. At R5, when the user is healed or heals others, they can gain stacks of an effect that end up granting 240 EM and 12 energy. This weapon is mainly good for its EM bonus, since it means you can focus more on damage stats, and while the energy regen is nice, his ER requirements aren't that heavy. I mentioned before that his burst heals him at intervals rather than one burst, and the reason was that you can proc this effect a lot easier with no external help. Talking Stick works well because Arashi self-applies Electro when casting his skill. This allows him to get a 24% damage bonus at R5. The high base attack and attack bonus don't really work on him due to his different scaling. On the topic of Battle Pass weapons, I'll remind you that Serpent Spine doesn't work because it specifies taking damage reduces the bonus, which Arashi unfortunately does. For the last 4-star, Rain Slasher is a decent option if you're running a more EM-focused build for the EC damage. Fortunately, the passive provides 40% damage bonus for Hydro or Electro-affected enemies, and that is still nice for his personal damage. When it comes to 5-star weapons, Red Horn works well as a general stat stick, but the passive isn't amazing since it buffs normal and charge attacks as well as scaling on defense. Beacon of the Red Sea has a nice crit rate substat and a 32% HP bonus for unshielded characters. However, the attack bonuses aren't that good on Arashi. Verdict has a nice skill damage bonus as long as you build him in crystallized teams. And finally, I don't know if you can make Fang of the Mountain King work, since that requires Burning and Burgeon teams, but if you can somehow slot Arashi into that team, more power to you, I guess. In general, he doesn't have a long list of options, especially since HP claymores are pretty niche. But the options he does have are the ones that are slightly used less, which helps create variety in weapon building in my opinion. With the regular options done, let's move on to my signature weapon. It has a 542 base attack and a 44.1% crit rate bonus. For its passive, the user gets a 20 to 40% max HP bonus. When nearby enemies take EC damage, the user will gain 4 to 8% skill and burst damage. They also gain 4 to 8% skill and burst damage when they take damage. Both bonuses max out at 6 stacks each, and stacks can be gained once every 0.3 seconds. Each bonus lasts for 7 seconds, will have independent durations, and will have independent cooldowns for getting stacks. Starting off with the breakdown, I chose to make the substat crit rate solely for the purpose of pushing him away from Marushase. People like to go for the signature weapon and pick their artifacts based on that. If you want to run him with his own weapon, you can't really run Marushase because the crit rate already caps out at 104%. This is kind of my way of incentivizing Vorokasha's Glow because that set is in dire need of more users. In terms of the passive, it's pretty straightforward. This plays off Arashi's mechanic of having enemies take EC damage, as well as him taking self damage. Despite its 20% HP bonus, it's not necessarily limited to HP scaling characters. Any Claymore can get the bonus as long as they're in a taser team, but in order to max out the bonus, they also need to be taking damage. This means Dia is going to make pretty good use of this weapon, despite not being an Electro or Hydro character. If you run her in some kind of overvape comp, this will provide the 48% damage bonus. Other Claymores such as Beidou, Dori, and Sayu can also work, simply because they work well in EC teams, but they can't easily get the bonus from taking damage. Since the weapon is specific to taking damage, it means Furina can't proc the effect just by HP draining, which makes the weapon a lot more niche. And I thought there'd be more to say, but that's apparently everything I have in this script. I'm saving team comms for part 3, since both Arashi and Kaito work in the same archetypes. So that's gonna do it for this first part of the special. This kit was a lot easier to design in my opinion because DPSs are just DPSs. The part I liked the most was figuring out how to design an EC DPS without making them shine better as a Quicken or Hyperbloom unit. I think the methods I used were effective because in the end, you're just not as reliant on EM stats as opposed to the other normal damage stats. But let me know what you think about my design in the comments. What did you like, what would you change, and are there any alternate ideas you might have? If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks again for watching everyone, and I will see you all in part 2. Bye!